Greetings all, BW here. This video, which is really going to be mostly audio, will be quite different from a usual content. We will be doing a deep dive into the Marvel character Marrow. As an X-Man from the late 90s, her continuity is a complete mess. But we're going to go through one issue at a time, or one story at a time, and mark out what I will call sort of her different eras, and occasionally take a stab at what the writers may have been thinking or not, or what they may have been planning or not. It's going to take a little while, and afterwards we'll talk about how I'd like to write her in a story and why I do, or rather, and why, and then also I do have a loose outline to follow here, but a lot of this is going to be me kind of going down rabbit trails because that's that's what happens when you talk about 90s X-Men. There are some significant events, though, that are worth noting up front, so I'll try to keep them as unbiased and brief as I can. In 1983, in Uncanny X-Men number 169, we are first introduced to the Morlocks, and these are mutant outcasts who have decided to live beneath the streets of New York City in a vast tunnel network that was once intended as a Cold War bunker complex, and they're led by a woman named Callisto. She wants to marry Angel, Warren Worthington, and has him captured. And so this story in this issue and the next is about the X-Men going down and rescuing him. There's a side plot where Caliban, who actually is a character that we had seen before, rescues Kitty Pryde. She gets attacked, and he rescues her and is nursing her back to health in hopes that she will marry him. And it's almost literally a side plot because all of the action, or all of that story, is kind of happening in a room off of one of the tunnels. The whole thing culminates in Storm challenging Callisto for leadership of the Morlocks and winning in a knife fight and stabbing Cal through the heart like a boss. I love that series of panels. It's really great, really well done. If you get a chance to read that issue, or even just find the set of panels, that page, it's really great. But this is comics, of course, so the injury is not fatal to Callisto. In fact, Kurt says that it would have been, but the Morlocks have a character named Healer, and so Callisto will get well eventually. Storm does offer the Morlocks a place in the world above, which is an exceptionally important thing to remember as we study Marrow. Storm did offer the Morlocks an opportunity to live in the upworld, but Caliban speaks for them and kind of says that they'll choose to remain. And so then we do see the Morlocks off and on over the next few years. In 1986, Marvel does a crossover event called Mutant Massacre, in which a group of people, mutant hunters called the Marauders, they begin killing Morlocks in their tunnels. Actually, it starts outside of their tunnels, but they ultimately end up in the tunnels killing Morlocks, killing mutants. Many of the Morlocks died as a result. Now, Magneto was in charge of the X-Men at the time, and in Uncanny X-Men 211, he observes, quote, "The horrors of my childhood born again. Only this time, mutants are the victims instead of the Jews." And then later in the same issue, Kitty notes, quote, "Everywhere we look, Peter, we find nothing but bodies. I'll never be all right again." Now, I share these quotes because while there are lots of little side plots and reveals and drama, this event leaves its mark on the X-Men team, especially Kitty, as she is ultimately trapped in her intangible form and nearly fades from existence before being saved, get this, by none other than Dr. Doom. So personally, as a rabbit trail here, I wonder why she would later choose to call her own team the Marauders. But that's an entirely different video, and we're not going to talk more about that here. It was unclear at that time when that issue or when that story came out who exactly was behind the Marauder attack. There weren't a lot of details. Sabretooth does mention in issue 212 that Mr. Sinister is involved, but details wouldn't be filled in / retconned for quite a while, and there would be a lot of that. But let's sidestep that for a moment and discuss another pivotal X-Men event called the Age of Apocalypse. The content itself of that event isn't particularly relevant to our deep dive on Marrow, aside from how it concludes. The timeline, the main timeline, is softly rebooted with a character named Dark Beast, who is Henry McCoy's counterpart in the Age of Apocalypse timeline. He ends up 20 years, coming onto the main timeline, 20 years before the divergence happens. So I'm going to make these numbers up just to try and kind of illustrate briefly what happens. Legion, who is Xavier's son, decides, let's say in like 1990, to travel back in time and kill Magneto during a time when Magneto and Xavier are still new acquaintances. They're still becoming friends. But he makes a mistake and he kills Xavier instead. So a new timeline is created and proceeds, let's say, back up to a 1990, but it's a different 1990, right? Drama happens and the timeline gets reset, but Dark Beast is able to escape the destruction of his divergent timeline. And so when he comes back, if I understand it correctly, and I may not, he comes back in 1950. So like if Legion's attack on Magneto / Xavier happens in 1970, Dark Beast comes back 20 years earlier than that. Now I might be following it wrong because it's really hard to follow sometimes, but the whole thing does get a little more illumination in 1997, which is actually jumping ahead a bit, but there's a flashback issue in Generation X number -1. And it's indicated that Dark Beast has been tinkering with mutants in the tunnels below the city for some time, which would be presumably those decades. But a lot of readers take that information to support the idea that he created the Morlocks. But I don't think this is the case. He's a villain. He has an ego. Of course he's going to say something like that. But that wouldn't mean that but that would mean that the Morlocks have only been in those tunnels for a relatively short time. And I just don't think that fits with what we read of them. It's worth mentioning that in his home timeline, there was a counterpart to the Morlocks, complete with a character who wore an eye patch named Artemis, and she escapes, and then kind of gets apprehended. So in my opinion, Dark Beast is not far back enough in time to justifiably fully create the 616 Morlocks. They're already in the tunnels for him to experiment on anyway. So they've already, at least in some number, been there. But it's also in that issue, in that -1 issue, that we learned that he's been looking after, watching, observing, stalking young Emma Frost. And the two of them have a conversation. I think Emma's about 16. Dark Beast explains to her that he doesn't quite remember his own past yet, which is kind of why he's doing the science of abducting and tinkering with the other mutants in the tunnels. Emma promises to help him with that. So they have a connection there. But of course, this is in 1997, we get this revelation, right? So if we go back to 1992, in Uncanny X-Men number 293, Mikhail Rasputin, who is Colossus's brother, floods the Morlock tunnels, which we are led to believe finally kills the remaining Morlocks. But spoiler, it doesn't. So the chronology is important here because, as I said at the beginning, it's all kind of a mess. The flashback to Emma and Dark Beast was written in 97, but in X-Men Prime, which is in 1995, which is after Mikhail flooded the tunnels, we first see adult Marrow, quote, summoning Dark Beast, who calls himself the Morlock's creator. But we'll shed more light on that when we read it. But it's important to know that the reason that things are kind of tricky, and I might be missing some things, so please feel free to correct me in the comments, it's because it is tricky. The whole thing is just kind of an awkward knot. Before we jump in the comics, let's talk briefly about Marrow as she is generally understood. This is not all evident up front, but this is kind of how everything is eventually revealed about the character. It's widely accepted that she has two hearts, though I suspect this was originally supposed to be more of a metaphor. The same way that Dark Beast created the Morlocks, but not really, I don't think. And for that matter, was he creating the Morlocks? Was he using the Morlocks to create Gene Nation? You know, it's kind of messy. Marrow heals, and she regenerates, and she fights on par with Wolverine, unberserked Wolverine. There's a scene where she's fighting. She actually gets the upper hand because she's being sneaky, and then Wolverine starts to go berserk, and the two of them get broken up. So she probably would not have beaten a berserked Wolverine because Marvel loves Wolverine. But the point is, she is a fierce fighter and on par with him, and in terms of healing as well. She is an expert tracker as well. Again, she's kind of like Wolverine Light in a lot of ways, which I think is both a pro and a con for the character. To try to differentiate her from Wolverine takes a little while. She has enhanced smell and dark vision, probably based on a couple things that are mentioned in different issues, which we'll cover. Her main thing is her bones grow uncontrollably and painfully, though again, depending on the story, that might get mentioned or not. And they can be broken off or forcibly grown into bladed weapons. so she can break off these growths and use them as weapons. Sometimes she'll actually grow them out. Like there's a much later in an issue of Weapon X, she like grows it out of her palm and then stabs like a blade from her palm. And then the other thing of note is that she, and this is what my notes say, she has a chip on her shoulder the size of the Juggernaut, and she seems to have a knack for fanatic leadership and terrorism, as we'll see. Not all of this is immediately evident, and there's going to be different versions of Marrow, so it's not all of this applies immediately, and not all of it applies, I don't think, to every single incarnation of Marrow, because writers emphasize different things, right? So enough of a preamble. Let's start talking about some comics. So Marrow's first ever appearance is in September of 1994. In Cable issue number 15. It's called In Shadows. It's written by Jeff Loeb. Again, I'm going to pronounce some names wrong here, and I apologize up front. The story opens in a flashback that says, quote, several months ago, when Mikhail flooded the Morlock tunnels, Thorn, who is a character, a Morlock character mutant, narrowly escaping that initial flood, finds a young Sarah cowering. So this is all in the flashback. She holds her hand, and she tells her not to let go, but the two of them are separated as the rushing waters engulf them. Thorn, who's tossed in the waves, remarks that there was, quote, there was something special about Sarah. She had no mutant powers that any of them knew of, and yet they were all drawn to her, talking about the Morlocks. Somehow in this hostile world created in the sewers beneath New York, among the stench and hatred that they all breathed, Sarah knew something about love. So that's what Thorn says about Sarah. And that's a flashback to something that happened several months ago, which is when the tunnels were flooded. So in the present day, Thorn finds Cable and Domino. They're on a little date. And she explains that she left the Brotherhood after Mask's death, which is kind of a reference to X Factor, some things going on in X Factor, and returned to the Morlocks only to find, quote, a madman leading them, which is presumably Mikhail. She explains that she searched the tunnels for survivors after the flood and only found Sarah, but she was, quote, there and not there. And she said that Mikhail had taken the Morlocks, Sarah said that Mikhail had taken the Morlocks to a place, quote, just out of reach. Sarah says the others are afraid to come out unless Thorn and the others perform the ceremony of light. They do. Sarah approaches them afterward, which proves that she's not just a hallucination. Everybody sees her. And she says that the ceremony was beautiful. And it really is. If you get a chance to read this issue, or even if you can find, like a Google image search of that page, it's really well written. It's a really great, it's just really great reading, The Ceremony of Light. And she says, so Sarah says that it's beautiful, but the others still won't cross over from the other side. She returns, but she tells Thorn that she'll, quote, come back someday. Okay, so it's not much to go on. It's understandable why some things will be retconned, sometimes unnecessarily, in my opinion. But this is the canon debut of Marrow. Note that Thorn doesn't say that she had no powers, which is important, only that others didn't know what they are. And Sarah is obviously mutant, and we know powers don't typically manifest until later, even if there's some early outward or uncontrollable signs of that power. It's my opinion that Sarah was just meant to be a one-off character, and the issue really centers more on Thorn and the Morlocks as a whole. Sarah is just kind of this plot point, and this writer never writes Marrow again. I'll say it again. Sarah's just a plot point, and this writer, Jeff Loeb, never writes Marrow again. And we won't see the character again for almost a year until we get to X-Men Prime. And, well, let's just keep talking. So in 1995, we have X-Men Prime. Racing the Night is the title of it. Scott Lobdell and I'm butchering these names, I'm sure, Fabian Nicieza, maybe. We open up, the story opens up. There's a lot in the story because this is post Age of Apocalypse, so there's a lot of storylines being wrapped up, but we're only going to really focus on the Marrow part of these issues. The book opens with 2 weeks ago, saying, sort of in quotes, referencing the Legion quest, where he goes back to kill Magneto. And then it says, quote, it appeared everything had returned to normal. So appeared is doing some heavy lifting there. Adult Marrow, for whom it has been subjectively over 20 years since her appearance in this dimension. So she's a young woman. She's now an adult in her mid-20s. She performs her version of the Ceremony of Light under the George Washington Bridge in Manhattan, which seems to summon Dark Beast, who recognizes his own work, his own hand in Marrow. Quote, "1 or 2 generations removed, true, but my work nonetheless. To be honest, your ancestors, the Morlocks, proved to be somewhat of a disappointment, with the exception of Callisto, of course." And then Dark Beast calls himself their creator. Marrow simply refers to him as First One. Okay, so we are picking up after Age of Apocalypse. This issue serves as an update on the status quo of the whole timeline. Aside from what we've already talked about, it's worth noting that this is the second time that we see Marrow, and it's the second time we see Ceremony of Light, which is, it's kind of an improvised version, but it's definitely that. And it's also not the last time we'll see a bridge featuring in a Marrow story, which I believe is intentional as well. So Marrow herself is wearing some funky black and gold armor and has a rather hideously evil sort of cliche approach, or not approach, but appearance rather. She kills a bystander who gets too close and sees what she's doing. There's an interesting typo here that says that it was Caliban, not Thorn, that was with Cable and Domino back in that earlier issue of Cable. And it's almost like you know, item A, to further support that different writers don't always share their ideas, or they weren't able to do the kind of research that they may have wanted to do or were interested in doing, because here in her second appearance we have a typo that references the only other time she shows up, and that actually happens a couple times as we go through. I'm not going to mention every one, but that sort of just like sets a pattern. So Marrow is now in this timeline. So we see her again about a month later in Generation X in August of 95 in Generation X number 6. So this is the story is called Notes from the Underground, and Scott Lobdell again is writing, and there are some co-writers. And Gene Nation, so there's a bit of a lead up to the story, right? Gene Nation kidnapped Emma Frost in the last issue, and Marrow had pinned Emma's security to the wall with like bone knives. Later, Hemingway attacked Generation X and said, which is in reference to, excuse me, which is in reference to the other dimension, which we're going to call the Hill dimension, Hill. He says, quote, "You are like the ones in the hot place, smaller, but like the olders. Do not kill, do not have fun. Hemingway is bad to enjoy stop life of humans. Same words for you as for them. Hemingway and friends left Hot Place to do as we like." So it seems that he was there to kidnap Leech, who isn't actually present. Emma was going to recruit Leech as a student, which gets revealed in the next issue. Artie is there, though. Artie and Leech both being characters who featured prominently in the Mutant Massacre storyline, by the way. Artie's there, and he knows where Gene Nation is. So this issue, in this issue, Generation X number 6, we open with Marrow, Hemingway, and Emma all talking. Emma had been heard of in their dimension, in that Hill dimension, and they are only keeping her alive, quote, "as a niceness to the First One," which is presumably Dark Beast, who is scheduled to arrive later. Leech is there too, and he's dampening Emma's powers, that's his mutant power. This is presumably why he was kidnapped, to keep Emma powerless, as Hemingway did say in the last issue, quote, "Now with the Leech, no one can shout at us." So Emma asks Marrow why they killed the people in a disco, which is a reference to Uncanny X-Men 322, which itself takes place a few days after X-Men Prime. So there's an indication that Gene Nation has been up to some no good stuff that doesn't necessarily get a lot of screen time, but it's been kind of going on in the background since their arrival. And Marrow replies, her response is, quote, "because they were human, because they got to live and laugh and party up world, while my ancestors, the Morlocks, were always sentenced to muck and mire and mud. All that, and we felt like it." Hemingway is impatient, but Marrow says that they've waited 20 years and they can wait a little longer, quote, again, quote, "as a nice to the First One." She also says that Leech is the last of their ancestors and that the Morlocks were an embarrassment and cowards, too afraid to, quote, "take back the night, even by the light of the moon." All right, so some good revelations there. Emma kicks Leech, though, and knocks him out, and then attempts to fry the brains of her captors. They are incapacitated, but Emma remarks, quote, they should be so much brain jello by now. But somehow there's something about their cerebral makeup that shielded them from my blast. So maybe we see a little bit of the work of Dark Beast in there, kind of making them resistant to psychic stuff or telepathic stuff. And she also says, quote, they're recovering rapidly, too quickly. Her students reveal themselves, the team, Emma's team, reveal themselves, and they discuss what happens next. All the while, they are watched remotely by Dark Beast. And he references, quote, a pen filled to overflowing with Morlock test subjects, which I think is a reference to Age of Apocalypse as much as it is the tunnels. He's not impressed with Gene Nation and says he doesn't like surprises unless he's responsible for making them. And then, quote, admittedly, I owe Marrow and her friends a modicum of gratitude. She summoned me, called me First One, to help them plot their little genetic revolution. But I have my own stratagem to consider, one well over 2 decades old. He laments that Emma had to get involved, and then he blows up the tunnel where the others are. And Emma senses a familiar presence just before it explodes, and that it was happy. So she's sensing Dark Beast, and that he's happy to blow them all up. But they escape, of course, without Marrow or Hemingway, and Emma tells Charles about Gene Nation. She's a telepath. And this is what she says, quote, they're evil. There's no other word for what I saw inside them, or what I didn't see. And she warns them all that they will hear from them again soon. So we have Lobdell writing again with some others, who's co-writers. There's been some murdering and some kidnapping, and it's been a group calling themselves Gene Nation, who are being led by Marrow. They refer to their previous habitat as the Hot Place, which we will learn is the dimension where Mikhail brought the Morlocks and from which young Sarah reached out to Thorn. It's revealed that Gene Nation are some of the descendants of those original Morlocks, and they resent them for having tolerated life beneath the Upworlders. In essence, they are radicals who seek vengeance, and a telepathic Emma calls them evil. Marrow seems to believe that she summoned Dark Beast, and they refer to him as First One, but we, of course, know better. And as far as I could find, the connection between Dark Beast and Mikhail about how they were working together is never really fully explained. The groundwork is there, and you see it if you read through these issues, but as far as I could discover, they never actually, they never even talk to each other, as far as I know. They're aware of each other, but they never actually even talk to each other. So we're not really sure of the details, which is kind of one of the threads that I think sort of got dropped along the way. Story ideas that just didn't come to fruition. We see Marrow in her big moment a couple months later in Uncanny X-Men number 325. It's called Generation of Evil. We have Scott Lobdell writing. So it continues the relevant parts from Uncanny X-Men 323, which itself took place 2 days after Trish Tilby broke the news of the legacy virus's possibility of infecting Homo sapiens. My goodness, I can read. So there's the legacy virus going on. Again, not important to Marrow, but is an important context for what's going on in the X-Men issues at this time. That there's this, there's a lot of background drama. Right? The doom pool is high, if we're going to put it in Cortex terms. Storm, Sam Guthrie, and Wolverine met Sack, who is inhabiting the body of Dr. Chen, while they were investigating the 33 deaths at the club, the disco. And then Vessel, who says, quote, the stated goal of Gene Nation. He doesn't say Gene Nation, but that's what he's talking about. The stated goal is the destruction of human society. And in issue 324, which was the issue directly before this called Deadly Messengers, which was Scott Lobdell writing, they battled and they end up interrupting an anti-mutant rally, which is being given by Graydon Creed in response to that club massacre. Beast helped out, which Hank McCoy, 616 Beast, helped out, which caused Vessel to remark, quote, Mikhail's breath, it's First One. He also refers to Storm as Betrayer. So that's kind of all in the lead up to this issue 325. In this issue, we open with the X-Men playing baseball. Not the last time we're going to see that. Colossus teleports in, bearing Callisto. And this is a reference to X-Men, not Uncanny X-Men, but X-Men number 44, which was written by Fabian Nicieza. in which Callisto says that it's definitely her, quote, give or take a decade. She sort of introduces herself to Colossus, and she has aged differently because time passes differently, as we'll learn in the Hill dimension. And she eventually explains to the X-Men who Gene Nation are. Quote, they are evil. Rather than talk about them, I'll use these holographic pictograms to show you the face of the enemy. To begin at the beginning, when Peter's brother Mikhail teleported the few surviving Morlocks from this plane of existence, he didn't make it through, which she knows is not true. We know it's not true, but she almost certainly knows it's not true. Trapped in a world that made the tunnels beneath Manhattan seem like paradise, we adapted. Years passed, apparently at a more accelerated rate than here. Despite the hard work, most of us eventually came to enjoy the world we were forging for ourselves. Until the second generation came of age. The young among us were disenfranchised, angry, consumed by rage that we, their elders, had been driven from our original home on Earth. Which, again, Mikhail teleported them. They weren't driven from their original home on Earth, but I think maybe she might be talking about like the upworld, the streets, and they were forced down into the tunnels. I'm not sure. They were upset that we accepted our fates, that made us seem weak. That we accepted our fates made us seem weak and pathetic to them. They rebelled against us, and they found means to come back to this world. A girl named Marrow is their leader. She is a child of twisted vision who will stop at nothing to redress past wrongs. So Marrow led a small band back here. How they got here isn't super clear. In fact, how Callisto got here isn't super clear. Teleportation magic. She explains that any previous encounters, because we've seen them before, any previous encounters that they had were tests in preparation for today, which she reveals is the anniversary of the Mutant Massacre. She reminds them of how Mr. Sinister's Marauders slaughtered the Morlocks, and the Gene Nation's goal is to kill a human for every Morlock that died. The planned event is in an abandoned housing project, and the biosignatures are blacked out, like when they're scanning, and they're being blacked out by a technology that resembles the technology in Callisto's suit. She has this sort of like cybernetic suit, and that's how they know, okay, well, if that's a similar signature, that's where they are. So we cut over to Sinister. Mr. Sinister, puzzling over recent events, unsure if his years of work are, quote, finally bearing fruit or simply rotting on the vine. So he's involved, he's watching. Again, some of these revelations are part of the sort of reboot, I think, / retcon. But anyway, the team that's inside, Storm, Callisto, Wolverine, and Colossus, they find someone mangled in a bicycle, like all twisted up in a bicycle, and pinned to the wall. Pinned to the wall with markings indicating the X-Men proceed in a certain direction, right? It's like a sign. A mile away, Reverb is able to sense the team's presence. Reverb is one of the Gene Nation. And he says, quote, muffled by tech cloak, but that's our own. Wolverine, Colossus, Traitor Storm, and, by the lights, Marrow, Callisto. Somehow she has followed us here. They never really go into detail about what these different powers are that these characters have. But apparently he's able to sense these people, and he's surprised that Callisto has made it from the Hill dimension. So Wolverine questions Cal how she could have such technology in her suit when, according to her own story, her own people were busy surviving. No answer comes. We do get some revelation later on in a miniseries called Storm. In the second of 4 issues, she notes that Callisto's armor looks a lot like the vegetation on the hill. So there's this nod to how organic life, or inorganic, or however you want to say it, like the armor and costumes that Gene Nation and Callisto have is actually not, even though it is sophisticated, it's not as difficult to manufacture in the hill dimension. So Hemingway, who Cal does note is more mutated than last she saw, which maybe, again, is a link to Dark Beast that never gets fully fleshed out. But he smashes through the tunnel wall, joined by Vessel, and battle happens. Cal shouts out to Storm, though, that it's just a diversion. She says Gene Nation is ruthless, and that she remembers what they did to Mikhail. Now, it's never explained what that is in reference to, But again, I think there's just some loose ends here that didn't get tied up. And by saying this, she is showing that she was lying earlier when she said that he died in transit, right? But anyway, they spot fleeing Upworlders. There's some people running out of a side tunnel, one of whom is revealed to be possessed by Sack, and he shoots Callisto. Marrow calls Storm weak for not killing him, to which Storm says she doesn't know her, but Marrow reveals they did meet once, years ago. Her name was Sarah. Storm remembers Cable telling her about Sarah in Cable issue number 17, but Marrow corrects her. They met the night Storm took over leadership of the Morlocks. This is not ever shown in the comics. She was disappointed that Storm didn't lead them out of the night and, quote, into the light. Which, if you recall, she did. Storm did offer that. But of course, Marrow was a kid and probably didn't pick up on the nuance. And Caliban said they were going to stay behind, and so on. So G Nation Marrow explains have returned to do it themselves to, quote, fight for a city free of Upworlders. The two of them, Marrow and Storm, duel with knives, which echoes the knife fight that she had with Callisto. And Marrow makes it clear that Storm's poor leadership and abandoning the Morlocks created her, right? She has a bomb. Marrow has a bomb on her heart, which is a detonator connected to bombs on all of the hostages, and Storm rips it out. She rips out the bomb detonator on Marrow's heart, and everyone assumes that that kills her, including the reader. It's indicated that she's dead. Like the last panel you see of her, she's on her knees, she's kind of bleeding out, and we do see Callisto flirts with Colossus a little bit, but then she teleports away. She has Sack, Hemingway, and Vessel. She doesn't have Marrow, and nobody actually references Marrow anymore. The last time you see her was after her heart was ripped out. So we are kind of led to believe that she has passed away. So we have Lobdell writing once more, and this is what we get. This is what we get. Marrow is basically just this one-off villain who is meant, in my opinion, who is meant to highlight the failures of Storm's leadership of the Morlocks to help reset the timeline for viewers at home. To be honest, I don't think much more thought was given to her character than that. I find it hard to believe that the original writer, Jeff Loeb, was planning on really doing anything like this with the young girl, Sarah, that reached out to Thorn. But she made good fodder for Lobdell to kind of recycle in a comic book style into an origin for this new villain, and that's it. So rather than making a character whole cloth, kind of connecting it back to Sarah from the Ceremony of Light and the Morlocks stuff, like, okay, all right, cool. There's connections, again, to the Ceremony of Light and Dark Beast and all this sort of stuff, but Marrow herself, in my opinion, was never intended to last, so she is killed in this issue. We also see more of Mr. Sinister. Eventually, it's explained that it was he who hired the Marauders to initiate the Mutant Massacre because he recognized a resemblance between what was happening down there, which is Dark Beast's tinkering, and his own sort of superior, in quotes, work, and he wanted the inferior versions destroyed. So there's a lot of the way that Dark Beast recognizes his handiwork in Marrow in X-Men Prime is kind of paralleled by the implication that Mr. Sinister notices some of his handiwork in the Morlocks in the tunnels, which is why he hired the Marauders to go and destroy them. The reason he would recognize his handiwork is because in the Age of Apocalypse timeline, Dark Beast was using a lot of Sinisters. They at one point had been working together. And so the reason that... Here we go. The reason that Dark Beast's work resembles Sinister's work is because it is based on Sinister's work. And why 616 Sinister would recognize it, but of course he would consider it to be inferior and want to destroy it. Like that's kind of the major retcon that gets laid over the Mutant Massacre. And there's another big one later on, and if you don't know, I won't spoil it in this moment, but it just keeps getting more retconny. Okay, so I mentioned the Storm miniseries, and 7 months later, we get the conclusion of the Storm miniseries, which is actually a really fun read. And in issue number 4, It's so wild to try to explain these things. I have spent over a year back reading and researching and cross-indexing stuff, and even now I'm not 100% certain on some things. Anyway, so the Storm issue number 4, which is called She Will Destroy You, it's written by Warren Ellis. In the previous issue, and this is in 96, in the previous issue, in issue number 3 of 4, we see Storm recalling the Morlock tunnels being flooded, quote, months ago. And we learn about how much the hill dimension works, or excuse me, about how the hill dimension works. You don't die there except by old age, but you get scars, and the weather is brutal, and the landscape is brutal, and it's all kind of part of this. It is all centralized around a hill. There's a sort of a castle on top of a hill, and there's a constant striving of people to earn their place further up the hill, to fight to get higher standing on the hill. And there's sort of this like violent, what is the phrase they use? Darwinism? Survival of the fittest, I think. That you just have to earn your place up there. And so that's kind of all revealed in a lot in issue 3. In issue 4, which is this issue that we're going to talk about, Storm laments her lack of leadership, inspiring Gene Nation. So she accepts that, and having to kill Marrow back in issue number 1. She kind of lamented that then. Mikhail extends his teleportation, so she eventually coerces Mikhail to bring all of the Morlocks, all of the mutants that are there, back to 616. Mikhail extends his teleportation to all of the hill, bringing all the mutants through, presumably only them, even though the text says, quote, the transfer effect bulges outward through walls and bulkheads into the air of the hill, and everything is reduced to sparks and emptiness. I don't think it destroys that dimension, it just empties it of all the mutants. And Cable, who is in the tunnels when this happens and they all arrive, he says it's, quote, a stadium's worth of people. So it's a lot of people. Callisto led Gene Nation with Mikhail. Presumably they were together, and she confronts Storm with a weapon. Storm explodes that weapon in Cal's face, and as she flees, Marrow reaches out to the injured Callisto. So Callisto is kind of left stage right, left stage right, exited stage right. And she's kind of running through the tunnels, and Marrow reaches out to her. And Callisto is surprised to see her alive, as I imagine we would be too as readers. And Marrow says to her, Callisto says, I thought she killed you or whatever. Marrow says, quote, she only tore my heart out. What need does a soldier of Gene Nation have for a heart? Besides, I have another. Come with me. I'll take care of you. Mikhail opens a portal to leave because he says, quote, he will be angry. Presumably he's talking about Dark Beast. But Storm blasts lightning at him. It lands a second too late. But the Gene Nationals who are there, the stadium's worth of people, see it as Storm destroying Mikhail, right? Even though that's not what happened, that's how they interpret the event. And they suddenly respect, or they will at least defer to, Storm. And she declares that they will be taken to a struggling village in Africa, while we see a disappointed and angry Dark Beast sort of in the shadows. And we read this: Mikhail Rasputin was working under his instruction. Gene Nation are his creatures. Another year would have given another generation of Gene Nationals, an elite strain of mutant warriors, his elite. And now he's lost them. Just like that. Mikhail will suffer for this, and so will Aurora Monroe. Okay, and that's pretty much how the issue concludes for our purposes. So we have Ellis, who is the third writer to use Marrow, but she's really just presented here as a simple way to keep Cal alive, and to keep the possibility of having her return later. More evidence is presented to support Dark Beast as the creator of Gene Nation, which we've already talked about. There's never any further information or explanation about how he and Mikhail were doing this. Cal is definitely involved. She was together with Mikhail at one point. In fact, they are kind of together, inexplicably together at one point before the flood, if I recall correctly. It's just kind of some messy stuff. This is also the idea where Marrow has two hearts, gets its origin, right? And it essentially becomes established and accepted moving forward. I still think it was more metaphor, especially considering the way she says it. It's sort of this poetic way. I think you could say that she just heals Because if I have one heart, which I do, and it gets damaged, and then I get a new one, I can still only have one heart and say it's my second heart, right? I can say I had another one or I grew another one. So I think there's some overtones there. But at any rate, her powers certainly go on to justify having maybe a second heart if you have a lot of bone growth and you need the extra blood or something. I don't know. But Cal as a character still has more page count than Marrow at this point. I don't think Marrow's survival was really as important as Callisto's survival. Marrow's still just kind of a throwaway character here without much thought given to her, in my opinion. It's worth noting that the exposition says, relative to Storm, Mikhail flooding the tunnels was only months ago, which means Marrow aged 20 years in that short span of time, right? That was these months that passed were the entire time that Sarah spent in the Hill Dimension. Given that she was old enough to remember Angel being captured, and that she was a young girl reaching out to Thorn, there's a sense in which there's not very much time at all between the debut of the Morlocks and this present moment. So certainly not more than a few years, which does get clarified a little bit in our next issue as some years ago. The Marvel, this is my notes, the Marvel sliding timescale works in mysterious ways. It really does. A year later, so this will be the last issue that we cover in this video, but a year later, we have a comic back to Cable. It's number 42, and this is in April of 97, and the issue is called Tolerance, and the writer here is Todd DeZago. The issue itself opens with a vignette in a church where there seems to be some Ascani cults searching out Cable, whatever. I don't really care. I don't really know any of that stuff. It's not relevant. It's relevant to the meta plot going on, but not to this issue. Where we see Cable and Storm at a concert, a Lila Cheney concert, and that concert is meant to welcome man and mutant alike. They were tipped off that the mutant insurgent Callisto would be attacking, and Storm says she needs to be here because the Morlocks are her responsibility. And quote, when I bested her in combat so many months ago, which I think is a reference to the conclusion of that Storm miniseries where she injured her and she went off into the tunnels and got rescued by Marrow. In that issue, in Storm number 4, Storm references their first duel, which is where Storm stabbed Callisto in the heart, as some years ago. And yet she also says of Marrow, so in this issue that we're reading, in this Cable issue, Storm says about Marrow, quote, only weeks ago, she forced me to kill her, which would have been Uncanny X-Men 325. Marrow remembers Cable from when he, Domino, and Thorn performed the ceremony, and they face off. Everybody faces off and discusses things in their respective pairs. So Cal tells Storm that the clubbers will have a chance to leave before their bomb goes off, but only one. Marrow, who is fighting Cable in the club, while Cal fights Storm outside, Marrow explains that the bomb will go off when Lila hits the final part of her song, which itself is called Tolerance, the name of this issue. And then Marrow remembers she forgot to warn the crowd. Oops. Cable telepathically warns Lila to not end the song, but Cal tells Storm, I love this writing, Cal tells Storm that there's a failsafe and that it'll go off 10 seconds after the song ends anyway. Thorn has it in hand, and Cable tells Lila to teleport it away, which is like her mutant power, and she does that. But by that point, Marrow and Cal have escaped. So it's not really a lot of revelation going on in this issue. DeZago is the 4th writer we've seen in 6 issues. So Lobdell did have co-writers with some of them. There are others, but I'm not, when they share the responsibilities, I'm not sure who's responsible for what. We read in this issue a fairly shallow use of the character Marrow as little more than a terrorist partner sidekick of Callisto, and it's the last time that we're going to see her in her black and gold armor. Admittedly, I do love a lot of the artwork that has been featured so far, both in this issue and in previous issues, even though it's sometimes inconsistent, even within its own issue, like panel to panel. But so if we're naming eras, right, if we're naming sort of the phases and eras of Marrow, the Sarah era, which is really just that first issue, Cable 15, where she's a kid, the rest of it up till now is sort of evil Marrow era, which is this first encounter with Gene Nation and some villainous behavior, and that kind of take on the character, and that's kind of where this ends. And in the next video, if this video is at all interesting to anybody and you want to see me continue, I have plenty of notes to keep on going. There is this change, a rewrite again in the character, sort of a different manifestation, a different interpretation, or a different take on the character. So this is sort of the pre-Marrow years, if you will, and I hope that it was informative to you if you were looking for a video on Marrow. I know that there was a lot of research that I did that had mistakes in it, which is fitting for the topic, but there were times I noted there was one website that I got a lot of my information from and a lot of my references from that had a misprint, and I then looked at other sites and those sites had the misprint as well. And I think it's just kind of a telephone game. You know, I'm going to make my own wiki and I want all the information ever about all the X-Men ever. And so I'm just kind of copying and pasting a bit and rewording. I would not accuse anybody of plagiarism, but the misprint was a citation. Like, this happened in issue 3. It was like, this happened in issue 352, but it was 325 or something like that. Numbers had been transposed, but it was consistent across several of the platforms, several of the sites. And it just kind of goes to show how one mistake in one place can get repeated over and over again. And so this whole project is kind of part of my attempt to set those things straight, as well as kind of explain how I think some of the features of the character came to be and were dropped and changed over time. I really love the character. I wouldn't be doing this. Remember I said in that one video, I don't make videos about Monopoly because I don't care about Monopoly. I care about this character, and I care about storytelling, and I care about Marvel and mutants, and there's a lot of really rich ground for cool stories, I think, with this character. And so I was drawn to her, and I embarked on this quest. So I'll stop here. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, observations, corrections, if I've missed something so far, you're welcome to mention it in the comments. There are some things that I haven't talked about that we will talk about in future videos whenever I am able to get around to doing it. Like I said, it's been a long time coming, so I'm in no rush. But this is also why I haven't done a Cortex video in a while. Every time I sit down to do a Cortex video, I end up like slowly backsliding into this Marrow direction. And I'm like, well, what if I just work on the script for Marrow? And then I end up reading comics from 30 years ago. Anyway, not a bad way to spend a day, but not a particularly focused one. Anyway, we'll wrap it here. Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate you. And I'll see you next time. Excelsior.